So now we have to cover the landscape. So this is a quick, very quick overview of trends from the last 3 admission cycles, 2023 to 2025. So what we see here, this is 2023, 2024 cycle. Data always lags. We don't have a complete data picture yet of the 2024, 2025 application cycle. So we're going with this one here. And this is just showing you the acceptance rates for different ranges of schools. So you can see, starting all the way over here on the far left, this shows you there's 35 or 2% of colleges and universities back in 2023, 2024 that accepted less than 10% of students. So 35 schools. Then next one, we have about 55 schools or 3% of all colleges and universities that accept between 11 and 20% of students. And then 95 or 5% of schools that accept between 21 and 30%. I show you this graphic for 2 reasons. One, I want to illustrate how many schools there are that accept between 31% and 100% of students. So there's a huge, huge field out there of options and opportunities for your students. However, these schools here, approximately the top 100, you could make an argument for the top 200, these are the ones everybody talks about, everybody wants. So many of the conversations that I have with families are about these schools here. And we're talking about quite literally 10% of all the colleges and universities in the country are the ones everyone is talking about and wants to apply to. And when we focus only on those, we're missing out on a whole field of options. And I will scream this from the mountaintops until my last day on this planet. But over here is where the money is. Over here, these schools, we can infer they can have pretty much any student they want who applies. So they don't have to entice them to enroll with scholarships, with any kind of reduction. So maybe they have need-based aid, which is important, but they don't have to entice them with any kind of reward for their great grades. Over here, however, that same super strong student that might be looking just over here could be enticed with really great scholarships. So this is why it's important to consider these other options. So over here, this is where everybody lives and hangs out and wants to get in. Over here is where the money is. So Joe mentioned this is the first in a 2-part series. Our second session is Wednesday, November 12th. And I will quickly put this in the chat so that if anybody wants to register, the link is in the chat. There we go. So that session will specifically be covering these types of schools and what a student could do to set themselves apart and have the best, most competitive shot. So I will be talking much more heavily about that. But I share this graphic, as I said, to illustrate the points I'm going to make when we talk about affordability. All right, here we are. So a couple notable trends, just to give you a quick lay of the land. There's been an increase in applications per student. We have, on average, 6.1 apps per student. In the 80s, that was approximately 3 per student. And many students I've known over the years want to apply to as many as 20 to 25 schools. So when you increase the volume coming in, you drive down acceptance rates. There's been a significant increase in states all across the country limiting the percentage of students, out-of-state students at public schools, so AKA state schools. For example, UNC Chapel Hill, that's in one of those, this little graphic over here. It's certainly one of these. UNC Chapel Hill for out-of-state students is around 11 to 15%, depending on the year. So that's really important to recognize. And they have a cap of 18%. Only 18% of students that they accept at UNC Chapel Hill are from out of state. And we've seen other states move with these state incentives. We've also seen an increase in certain majors right now that are hot, that everybody wants. And what that is doing is even at schools that generally are not selective overall. It's becoming increasingly selective to get into these majors. So whenever I have a student tell me they want nursing, for example, I know right away we need to cast a wide net because there's a high likelihood they won't be able to have all yeses to their nursing. So we need to cast a wide net of schools. Or, for example, a student that might say business, we have lots of conversations about business adjacent majors, especially if they're gunning for highly selective business programs. And then we're seeing an uptick in students moving south for college. They're seeing the SEC schools every Saturday with the big football games. They want that rah-rah experience. But what we're starting to see then is selectivity becoming increasingly limited at these large public institutions in the South because they've seen a massive uptick in applications. So this is just a visual to illustrate the growth in applications by selectivity. So what you're seeing is this blue line up here. All schools that accept applications from the Common App, that's one application that goes to multiple schools. Any school that is on Common App is represented here, and we're showing if they've been a member of Common App for the last 10 years. What we see here is the most selective schools in the country, those ones in the highest band of my other graphic, less than 25%. They've seen significant, we're talking in the millions, uptick in apps over the last 10 years. And we see it across the board that's happening. And a big part of that is because we've had the most high school graduates in the last several years as well. But just explaining that there's been a significant volume increase. This slide here illustrates the top 30 most applied to colleges in 2025. So we start right off the bat, UCLA, UC San Diego, and we're almost to 150,000 applications. And just to give a framework for that, picture like I'm in Columbus, so the horseshoe football is my frame of reference. That holds 102,000 people. So if you've ever been to a football game, a college football game, picture that stadium full. And then that capacity is probably in this range here. So students really have no sense of how many people that is. And so when I hear a student tell me they want to apply to one of these schools, we have to have a lot of hard conversations about how this would be a super reach school, not because you are not competitive, but because you're one of those 100 and some thousand people in that stadium who's also applying. So here's a couple more visuals. I had the band here at 50,000 just to kind of show that was the fairly common denominator among these top 30 most applied to schools, around 50,000 apps. So you're seeing even the Ivy Leagues are getting above 50,000. So here's the University of Hawaii Stadium. So one student applying to Harvard would be, this is how many apps approximately they got last year, just this last cycle, and that would represent one student would be one applicant. And if you're in Ohio, as I am, the Schottenstein Center, you could fill up the shot 2.5 times to represent the number of applicants that the Ivy League gets every year. So again, helpful visuals just to help you as parents to calibrate your expectations as well as your students. And then if any of these schools, and note California, so we talked about UCLA, if any of these schools are in states that have incentive programs for students, in-state residents to stay in state, or are schools that put caps on out-of-state applicants and the percentage of students that can be admitted, that makes the context that I'm providing you with these visuals that much more important. So if your child says, I want to apply to UCLA, you have to understand that every public institution in California has a cap of out-of-state students, percentage of out-of-state. So at the most, at best, they have a 22% shot at being admitted. And then most likely at the UCLAs and the UC Berkeleys of the world, it's closer to 3 to 5%. So this is really important for you as a parent to understand this bigger context so you can coach and counsel your student when they're building the list. So this also factors into affordability. If your student is one of 150,000 students applying at UCLA, and maybe you are not a family that qualifies for any need-based aid, you are probably not going to get a lot of merit money if your student even gets in to go there, because they have their pick. They don't have to entice students to come. I mentioned hot majors. So I said at the top, the university admit rate, you're seeing 3 schools here, and you're seeing computer science, engineering, and business being separated out. Underneath each of the logos, you're seeing the university's general admit rate, and then you're seeing the admit rate for that major specifically. Now, not every school publishes their admit rates by major, and similarly, not every school admits by major, meaning there are some schools, plenty of schools, that are what we call single door entry. If you're in, you're into whatever major you applied as or eventually choose to do. But schools like, we'll use Purdue here in the middle, their engineering admit rate, they read by major. So applicants who are applying as seniors in high school for engineering are being read as engineering majors. And right away off the bat, at best, have a 30% chance of being admitted for engineering. And then it's very difficult if they go in as another major to even transfer into engineering later. So it's important to have this context as well. Your student might look at the 82% admit rate at Indiana and think, oh, that's a safety school for me or a likely school. But if they're doing business at Indiana, they definitely need to have a backup major in mind that would be business adjacent. I mentioned in the trends, the lure of the South, lots of schools being applied to in the South. We see that here. So we're seeing the uptick. University of Tennessee got hot there for a while. They were in the top 25 in football the last 2 years, and we saw a 378% increase in enrollment of students who came from the Northeast. So that was just in the span of 10 years, we've seen this uptick. A few other trends. Ever since COVID, we have seen a trend of grade inflation. Essentially, everyone's getting A's, is the best way I can put it. The University of Michigan released a statistic last year that showed that something around, I want to say it was 75% or higher of the students that applied had a 3.8 or higher. Whereas compared to, and I think they did a comparison with, it might have been 20 years ago, it was something, it was so distinct. It was something like only 10% of students had GPAs above a 3.8. So we've seen it across the board. Everybody has great grades. And a lot of this has to do, we think, with COVID and just softer grading practices and trying to usher students through a really difficult time. But that is also now why so many schools have returned to testing, because they need something, a different kind of measure, because the grades don't always tell the whole story. It's very common for us to see students with perfect 4.0s and great grades in their classes, but then have test scores that are significantly opposite of their grades. And this is where a lot of schools are now wanting to see standardized testing again. And then we are approaching the demographic cliff. I don't know that I would call it a cliff per se, but a gradual decrease over the coming years of the 18-year-olds who will be graduating high school and going to college. This could lead, well, it is leading in some cases to closures and financial strain on colleges. And then right now we have a big unknown in the world of international student enrollment. Current federal policies are, we don't have any data yet, except qualitative and what we're kind of hearing out of the early rounds, that international student applications to US universities are down. So what will the long-term ripple effects of that be? So trends matter. They can help you build your list. I use the example about engineering at Purdue, but this could be with any of those hot majors. And it helps you understand how your student compares in the wider context of admissions and what those outcomes may look like. And it's really important to calibrate our expectations as parents. You might think the world of your kiddo, and I'm sure they are exceptional and awesome in your eyes. But when they are one of 150,000 applications to UCLA, it's really important to calibrate those expectations of maybe all 150,000 of those applicants are also awesome and exceptional. So helping you and your student to really go into this with their eyes wide open and have balanced expectations.